The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members have access to exciting opportunities through their involvement with the Institute. This includes volunteering for evening programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program, presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask some questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I will come around with the microphone. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Abel, an Associate Professor of Military History.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Today we have a real treat. Dr. John Kuehn is a retired naval aviator, which I think makes him maverick, as well as a historian of all things sea power, World War II, has just released a book on the strategy in the Pacific. He is definitely one of our department rock stars, and I mean that literally because he's an accomplished musician as well. And in particular today, it's a special and relatively rare talk because Dr. Kuehn is going to be talking about something not only that he knows about as a historian, but that he has actually done, the Combat Information Center. So please join me in welcoming Dr. John Kuehn.
Thank you so much, John. And, I wish you hadn't run off, I'd shake your hand. But thank you for that more than gracious introduction. Well, today we're going to talk about the CIC. I'm going to take initially a historian's approach, and we're going to look at, where did this come from? What were the drivers? Why did we need to kind of change the way we'd done business on ships for thousands and thousands of years and move the command of a ship in combat and fight the ship, not from the bridge, but from the Combat Information Center that's in the bowels of the ship. And that doesn't get any sunlight at all, at least in U.S. Navy ships. Maybe in a British ship, they might have a porthole that they could open up and let the sun in, but not on a U.S. Navy ship, which we famously don't have portholes. So that's what we're going to take a look at. I'll talk a little bit about these later. I have some words on both of these pictures, but it basically shows you that we're going to go from 1800 to today. All right, so beginnings from the quarterdeck to the bridge, and that's the quarterdeck, all right? But that's not the bridge, so we're not to the bridge yet. We'll talk to the bridge in a second. So initially, when commanding ships in the days of sail, it depended on the type of ship, but normally the command of the ship would be where the helm of the ship was. And normally the helm is on the quarterdeck, and this is the quarterdeck. This is the poop deck. Not all ships have a poop deck. Poop deck is for a flag officer. And so the quarterdeck was where the ship would be commanded from. The captain would be there. If the captain was not on the quarterdeck, he would usually have an officer with the conning officer on the quarterdeck who would give orders to the helm. The helm was usually manned by a petty officer or a petty officer in training of lengthy experience. And so that's where you commanded the ship in battle, and they would communicate via signal flags. Sometimes they would use cannon to signal things as well, and then when the age of pyrotechnics comes along in the 18th century, you start to get things like colored smoke and flares and stuff like that, but most of the commanding is done with signal flags and then orders to the helm and then orders from the captain on the quarterdeck to the gun deck for battle. So that's how things were going until steam arrived, okay? And again, this is Admiral Nelson on the quarterdeck. This is the captain of the ship, so he's actually got the con. That's Captain Hardy, who was also with Nelson at the Nile. And this is Captain Hardy with Nelson at the Battle of Copenhagen. Nelson famously has the telescope to his blind eye, saying that he does not see the signal of recall, all right? And that's how he commanded. That's how they commanded. So that's just an example of command at sea in the age of sail. But then these ugly, dirty things came along, powered by coal and steam engines, and everything changed. Now, initially, these were paddle wheelers, all right? They were paddle wheelers. And when you had two paddle wheels on each side of a ship, you normally had a walkway between the two sides of the paddle wheel on the paddle wheel ship. Well, warships also started employing paddle wheels and steam, and that area that connected the two paddle wheels became known as the bridge. And because it was up a little higher, it made more sense than the quarterdeck. And so instead of being back on the quarterdeck back here, you moved forward to the bridge. Well, when paddle wheels went away and we went to steam-driven screws on these ships, they kept the bridge and kept commanding from the bridge. So it's sort of an accident of sort of tradition that the bridge became where they commanded from. And this is where the captain would be. He would con the ship. If he was not up here, if he was below or doing something else on the ship, he would have a conning officer or an officer of the deck in charge, and they would command. And this is an example of the stat going on at the Battle of Manila Bay. That's Admiral Dewey on the flagship, the USS Olympia. And here's an actual picture of Admiral Dewey on the bridge commanding a ship, although I think this was actually a posed shot after the Battle of Manila Bay. Okay? So that's where we are for command and control on a ship. And then, of course, with other ships, you're still using signal flags, although there is new technology available. It is called the searchlight. All right, so at night, and that allows ships to communicate with each other at night via searchlight, but it's all based on being able to see either signal flags or searchlights. When I entered the Navy in 1981, the Navy was still using signal flags. The Navy was still using searchlights, all right, particularly in a situation called emission control, where you turn off all your radios and radars, or you turn off the transmitters, and you just communicate without any electromagnetic transmissions. And the Navy used to practice that. I don't know if they practice it anymore, but if they do, it'll be a real surprise for the Chinese. All right, and then this thing showed up. Okay, so this is the telegraph, but this is more than just a telegraph. It is wireless telegraphy. So ships start to communicate, and this is driven by British technology using wireless telegraphy. Now, this is not voice communications. This is deet, 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 deet. The equipment to process this was normally located in the bows of the ship because it was very, very heavy, and you wanted to put it lower in the ship to help with the ballast, to keep the center of the gravity of the ship lower, not higher. You don't want high center of gravity in ships. You want low center of gravity in ships, sort of a basic feature of ship design, at least warship design. And so now we get electronics on the ships, but we're not tactically controlling ships with wireless telegraphy. We're actually doing what we would call operational control, which is like take the fleet and go to the Marquesas, all right? And then you get to the Marquesas, and it's like, hey, take the fleet and go to Valparaiso. Okay, so that's what wireless telegraphy gave you. It did not give you tactical control. The British tried tactical control prior to Jutland using wireless telegraphy, and it didn't work. It was a disaster. By the time the messages got up from the wireless telegraphy room to the bridge, the situation had changed so much that it didn't really matter anymore. So those great fleets that are bumbling around in the North Sea at Jutland in 1916 are communicating to each other with signal flags, all right, signal flags. And then if they're involved in night combat, they're communicating to each other with searchlights, okay, searchlights. And these are what those ships looked like. Again, there's the bridge. Dewey would be comfortable up there. Even Admiral Horatio Nelson, H.P. Wilmot, wrote one of his books on the Battle of Leyte Gulf, that Admiral Halsey didn't understand command, and so he was basically commanding a fleet of over 400 warships in the same way that Nelson was commanding his sailing vessels at Trafalgar, all right, which was a valid critique, I think, especially when you look at the thing there. So these are British warships. This is a battle cruiser. And they have the ability to receive wireless telegraphy and send signals. But the command of the ship is still taking place here. up on the bridge. The U.S., on the other hand, said, well, we've got this new technology, let's bet the farm on it. And so the United States Navy got into bed via Stanford C. Hooper, who was part of the Bureau of Engineering Radio Division. And he convinced Admiral Sims, the big hero of World War I, and now president of the Naval War College, along with Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels, to bet the farm on wireless voice communication. And so now we've got wireless radio. And this is the biggest single change that's going to lead to the development of the Combat Information Center. And so that's Hooper in the back there, and then there's Sims and there's Daniels. Also involved was the Naval Research Lab, and then a very, very fruitful government corporation cooperation and partnership with RCA. In fact, the Navy's relationship with RCA will help RCA weather the Great Crash in 1929. All right? RCA's stocks went way, way up. They were way overvalued then when they crashed, but they still had the Navy, and so anybody that hung on to RCA stock made a mint once the 1930s came along. The other U.S. advantage is going to be in air, is going to be in radars. Radars are radios, okay? They are radios. They're just at higher frequencies, although the first radars were essentially high-powered radio sets. But they're radios that collect the backscatter when radio waves bounce off objects, like other ships and airplanes, all right? And so that's what a radar is. And in the interwar period, the United States, the British were developing radar. We weren't the only ones. The Germans were developing radar, so were the Japanese. But the Americans really start to play with this stuff, particularly air search radar, prior to getting involved in World War II in 1941. We also have got voice radio, particularly a circuit called TBS, very short-range voice radio, to communicate. And what it ends up happening is every United States Navy warship will be outfitted with TBS short-range voice radio. Every aircraft carrier will eventually get an air search radar, a two-dimensional air search radar. And then certain surface ships will be given radars, will be given surface search radars. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So again, an air search radar, a 2D air search radar, can only give you a vector towards an approaching object, but it can't tell you what altitude that object is at, all right? So that's what a 2D air search radar is. And then a surface search radar does essentially the same thing for surface contacts, okay? Can you use one of these to pick up air contacts at low altitude? Yes, you can. Can you use one of these to pick up surface stuff that are at the bottom edge of the radar's beam? Sometimes, but usually they have to be very close. And anytime you have one of these on a ship, you're going to have one of these too. All right, so the Navy has got these radars and these radios, but what hasn't it got? It hasn't got a system to bring it all together for information, at least for in a mature fashion that you can build a doctrine around. So the first CIC is going to come what they call the Jeep plot. The Jeep plot will be the CAXM radar on the California, okay? And the CAXM radar is a radar that's in the area of what we would call very high frequency. So it's a VHF radar. These are radars that look like seating areas in a football stadium. Sometimes we call them the grandstand type radios because they're huge, okay? They're big radars, all right? They're really, really big radars because they're so low frequency. So the lower the frequency, the bigger the radar. Just use that as a rule. And what they find out playing with this in the fleet problems in the 1930s, particularly later in the 30s when they start to put these on board the ships, is that not only can they provide early warning of an approaching air raid, but that you could use them to direct your own fighters via voice onto the enemy raid, And so they start to practice that. Of course, what does that mean for all U.S. naval aircraft? They will be outfitted with voice radio, okay? Because of that, Navy airplanes will be a little larger and a little bit more rugged with a little bit more robust electrical systems to support those radios, okay? Those radios, all right? So and this is a picture on one of the carriers. This is actually, I think, the Saratoga. Now, first they put it on the battleship California and sort of did proof of concept there, and then they started playing with this thing on one of the aircraft carriers, and they called it the Jeep plot, and that just comes from GP, general purpose, okay? So that's why you might go, well, why do they call it the Jeep plot, right? Because it's on a Jeep carrier? No, not yet, all right? So the CAXM-1, I did have a picture of it, but I'm sorry, I think it went away when I transferred the slide deck. So the first major tests of the CXAM radar, and it's kind of hard to see in this shot, it's actually behind the aircraft carrier, the CAXM radar, is on the carrier raids and on Midway and at Coral Sea. And so these carrier raids that take place after Pearl Harbor, then the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942. In fact, today is one of the anniversaries of the Battle of the Coral Sea, all right? The Navy's first operational victory over the Imperial Japanese fleet, and then the Battle of Midway, all right? And by this point, these radars have a height-finding capability. Now, initially, they actually put separate height-finding radars. Now, an air search radar to get bearing and range, and I'm going to do some funny dancing here, has to go like this. It has to kind of rotate, right, to kind of get a picture, right? A height-finding radar moves up and down like this, all right? And eventually what they'll do is they'll get a radar that can do both. And all they need to do is put in some bearings and do some of that stuff. So by the time we get to 1942, not only can they tell you that there are 17 contacts coming from Papua New Guinea on a bearing of 095 at a range of 60 miles, all right? They can also tell you what the altitude of those contacts are. Because you could go out there, but you could totally miss the raid if you don't know what altitude they're at. Believe me. And again, the aircraft don't have radar. In the early days when they were testing these things out, the naval aviators would go out to the intercept point and they'd go, I don't see anything. And they'd go, well, you're right on top of them. And they'd look down and there'd be nothing. And they'd look up and there'd be clouds. And the guys would be above them, above the clouds, all right? So that's why they needed the height-finding ability. In all of these battles, the Jeep plot in the carrier basically becomes the prototype of the Combat Information Center. It is not on the bridge of the carrier up here. It is actually down here on the O2 level of the carrier, all right? And it's manned pretty much like you see it here, all right? It's not a very big space. Eventually, a CIC will come to be a space about as large as this room, at least on a modern aircraft carrier. And on an Aegis cruiser, it's not much smaller, to be honest with you, or an Aegis ship. But here you can see they're sort of sitting on top of each other. They've got charts on the wall. They're talking to squadron ready rooms on sound-powered phones. They're talking to airplanes on radio. They're doing plotting. And again, it's all very sort of ad hoc. The next evolution for the CIC, this will be outside the carriers, will be with surface search radars and on surface ships. Up until the Battle of the campaign of Guadalcanal, surface ships were still basically being commanded like Dewey commanded at Manila Bay, with the Admiral on the flagship, and then the Admiral's flag bridge would be above the bridge of the ship, okay? And so that's how they would be commanded, essentially without incorporating the information from the radar. Now, not all these ships had radars. At Guadalcanal, what we're going to find out is the only ships with decent radars are going to be the picket ships. They're going to have this radar called the SC radar. And they'll be so unfamiliar with how to use these things that they'll actually pick up the attack of a Japanese force at Savo Island, but they won't know that they're ships. In fact, initially, the destroyer USS Blue will think they're islands and say, oh, that's an island over there, all right? And then there's another island. Where did that island come from? Like, hey, there's a lot of islands up there that we didn't know about. They turned out to be Japanese cruisers, all right? Eventually, there's another radar that comes along that's a higher frequency radar. Whenever you get a higher frequency radar, the rule is more resolution, more detail, all right? A better target, all right? And what they'll do is they'll go with something called the plan position indicator. Basically, they'll create a scope to mimic the cathode ray tube and the other things that are giving you sort of a vertical presentation and turn it into a 360-degree presentation, okay? And that is a PPI right there. That's a PPI, all right? If you ever go watch the old Battle of Britain movie, you can kind of see what they were doing before PPI. So go watch the old Battle of Britain movie, you know, with Sir Laurence Olivier and Michael Caine and Christopher Plummer, and when those guys are inside the chain home radar hut. And imagine that chain home radar hut, that's a CIC, all right? That's a one way for you guys to kind of get that, all right? All right, so these things are not on the bridge, they're down in the bows of the ship. And what they learn at Guadalcanal is they can't command from the bridge anymore. They've got to have some place that they're integrating the information, putting together a picture so they can make tactical decisions. During the Battle of Cape Esperance, which is a night battle, this is the first time radars will give warning that the Japanese are approaching. And this is the first time they'll give warning that they actually act on, all right? And that's Admiral Norman Scott, who was in command at that battle. Heavy losses at the battle. And so they're starting to think, hey, we can use the radar more effectively to command and control in battle. Now, you're probably asking, well, how are the Japanese doing this? They're doing it the same way the Americans are from the bridge, all right? They don't have CICs either, okay? So if you were wondering that, I've preempted that question, or I can add more to it later during the question period. Finally, we get both CICs in the big battles that are the climax of the Guadalcanal campaign. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Island, where essentially the Japanese overwhelmingly outnumber us, but because we have air search radars on the Hornet and the Enterprise, the Japanese only managed to sink one aircraft carrier and damage the other one. And at that point, the United States has no aircraft carriers left, okay, until Enterprise gets fixed. The other key battle also involves radar, and that will be the night battles of Guadalcanal, particularly the last one where Admiral Willis Lee on the battleship USS Washington will actually be history's first CIC officer and command the Washington while looking at the radar and make his judgments, and he will obliterate a Japanese battleship using radar-directed gunfire at night at the final battle there. And that's a sort of a picture of what that battle looked like. It was probably a lot less clear and more chaotic than that. So Lee is on the Washington. We'll show you a picture of him later. Also in this battle is a Fletcher-class destroyer, brand new class destroyer. It has the best radar, the SG radar on it. And the XO tells his CO, hey, listen, there's a place behind the bridge called the surface plot. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a radar repeater scope in that surface plot. I'm going to have sound-powered phones to the gunnery officers. I'm also going to have a voice thing, and then I'm going to have a little porthole that I can talk to you through. And so this is the first surface ship CIC that he sort of jury-rigs, but it occurs at the same time of Willis Lee. And so some people give him the credit as being the first CIC officer, Commander J.C. Wiley, and not Lee. It doesn't matter. They're both at the same battles. They're both kind of doing the same thing. Of course, Lee is an admiral and he's in command, and Wiley is the XO in the surface plot behind the bridge. But Wiley writes all of this up, sends it to Pac Fleet and Admiral Nimitz. And Admiral Nimitz, and there's J.C. Wiley, that's after he became an admiral, and that's Admiral Lee. He dies at the end of the war, basically of exhaustion. Wiley goes on to have a very good career after the war is over. So Admiral Nimitz reads what Wiley has to say, and he publishes this based on Wiley's input, and it's Fleet Tactical Bulletin 4 Tango Bravo TAC 42. And it's the Fleet Tactical Bulletin for Pacific Fleet Radar Doctrine. So now, not only do we have spaces, technology, now we have doctrine. Now we have doctrine. At the same time, Nimitz finds out that Wiley is in command of a destroyer minesweeper, the USS Trevor, and he says, you're removed from command, but don't worry, this is a good thing. You're not being removed for cause. You're actually going to be promoted. He brings him back to Pearl Harbor, and he says, what were you doing on the Fletcher? And while he describes what he was doing, he's going, okay, build a mock-up here in Pearl Harbor, and I want you to train people how to do this. And so Wiley starts training people on what he was doing, and eventually what comes out of that is the Combat Information Center Handbook for Destroyers. This comes out less than a year after Wiley was practicing this in the heat of combat at Guadalcanal. So the timeline here are fascinating. They go from initial concept idea to formalized doctrine in less than 9 months. At the same time, the Pacific Fleet will also publish something called PAC-10, which is the CIC doctrine for carriers. And now the United States Navy is the only Navy in the world that has published CIC doctrine to do combat information and control in combat. Well, this will be the ultimate test. This will be manned cruise missiles from several axes against an amphibious invasion of Okinawa, and the Navy will finalize its doctrine and improve upon its doctrine at Okinawa, fighting the kamikaze attacks that result. It's a very, very bitter contest, but what the Navy ends up doing is sort of finding out what are the weak areas in our doctrine, what are the strong areas, and out of Okinawa comes this idea of the picket ship, all right, the picket ship. And that turns into something called the Picket Identification Radar Zone, or PIRAZ. We still use PIRAZ today. Call sign for PIRAZ is Red Crown, Red Crown. And that comes out of Okinawa, all right? And so when I went on board the John C. Stennis as a CDC officer, I owned Red Crown, all right? I also owned Strike, all right? So I owned the networks. So these are radio networks to control both the radar surveillance as well as the fighter direction. And this is the first time that the United States Navy has a multi-dimensional integrated air defense net using all of its radar assets on all of its ships, not just its destroyers and cruisers, but also its aircraft carriers. Eventually, they will put Army radar sites on some of these islands that they seize, and it will be the first joint air defense network in history at Okinawa. Okay, now Okinawa was, well, this is 2025, 80 years ago, right? 80 years ago, am I right? Yeah, 80 years ago, all right? That doctrine is still our doctrine today. So let that sink in, all right? All right, that's pretty major. And there's a picture of some of this stuff going on in Okinawa, picket ships out there. In the 50s and 60s, this is what CIC, at least on an aircraft carrier, or maybe even on a surface ship, started to turn into. Look at that computer. This is probably more 70s, maybe even the 80s, all right? There's your PPI. That hasn't changed. One of the things they found out, though, is that they could surround the guys that were working the radars and working the radio telephones with plexiglass boards. And then guys could go write on them in grease pencil to say, you know, here's Cap 256, it's at Station Polecat. And then they realize, hey, I can't read the board because the guy is in front of it writing, so he goes to the other side and he learns to write backwards, all right? And that's still a feature of training of operations specialists at Operation A School in Dam Neck, Virginia. They learn how to write backwards. So if you ever want to learn how to write backwards, join the Navy. We'll teach you how. And then we'll put you in a CIC, an aircraft carrier, all right? Here's a big PPI. This is actually a surface PPI, not an air PPI, all right? And as you can see, there's a lot of gear, a lot of technology. And again, this technology that you're looking at here is probably about 40 years old. About 40 years old. Okay. Today, additions to CIC. The call sign for CIC on the ship, any ship, is combat. Combat. If you become the Combat Information Center Officer, the CICO, or the Combat Direction Center Officer, the CDCO, your call sign is combat. And it's like one of the coolest call signs you can ever have, you know. Combat, skipper, you know. So it's a really cool call sign. And it has turned into a multi-domain warfare module. So it's not just surface warfare, it's not just air warfare, although those are two of the principal elements. It also includes anti-submarine warfare and electronic warfare. Yes, jammers, as well as ELINT, electronics intelligence surveillance, where you listen for radars. The other big thing that developed in the Navy were data links. So the Navy discovers in the 50s that they can start to transmit data links on HF at the extremely high rate of 75 baud. All right, and you might go, what's that? You know, 75 baud. 75 baud is like nothing. I mean, you could probably buy toys in the local toy store that have higher baud rates than 75. But back then, in the 60s and the 70s, and so what we started to do on these air defense nets is not share the data via voice and then write it all out. We would actually digitize it, an early form of digitization with digital machines, turn them into tracks, and then those tracks would be shared in a data link system, and then the system would be displayed on a large screen display, the LSD. So in the Navy, LSD doesn't mean tripping out. The LSD means looking at contacts on a large screen display, the LSD, all right? When I was on the Stennis, this is what our Combat Direction Center looked like, all right? Now, I reported to the Stennis in 1998, brand new commander, and I was made the Assistant Operations Officer / Combat Direction Center Officer, and this is what I controlled. The main part of the combat was the TAO station. TAO stands for Tactical Action Officer. So that's an officer who the captain and several of the senior officers, including me, on the ship examined via a board on threats and on procedures, on tactics, on doctrine, and then we give them a letter, and they now are a tactical action officer. And in the absence of the presence of the skipper in combat, the tactical action officer is authorized to make decisions, like launching fighter aircraft to intercept bears, or a bear is a Soviet surveillance aircraft, or weapons release authority. Tactical action officers have weapons release authority. So they could actually order shooting the missile systems, taking a particular track. That's how we say it. Take track 1626 with birds. That means fire our surface-to-air missile system against that track and shoot it down, all right? We could also assign those tracks to other ships in the battle force via the data links. So that's where the TAO is. He's also got the weapon stations here. On my ship, the missile person was over here, and our best missile person was a CS4. That's a Combat Systems Petty Officer, 3rd class, and she was a she. She was our best person. And then over here we had another station, another weapon station for our close-in weapon system. Now this has changed on current aircraft carriers. Now they have things like rolling airframe missile. They don't have CWIS. Some of them have CWIS, but we have rolling airframe missile. And I've heard they're going to replace the Sea Sparrow systems with another system. But that's what we had back then. We had a close-in weapon system, which is a Vulcan Phalanx close-in weapon system, and then we had a medium-range defense system, and then we had our fighters. So right next door to us is where we had our air controllers. Those are the guys you see in Top Gun that are saying, Maverick and ICE, you know, take Vector 686, intercept bogey 219. You know, they're doing that kind of stuff, all right? And usually we'd have 3 or 4 of those guys on station. They also controlled the network for the radio network. That was called the Strike Network. And anybody who came near our aircraft carrier had to check in with Strike. John C. Stennis' call sign was Courage, so we were Courage Strike. That was our call sign, okay? Behind these guys was our electronic warfare module, all right? The electronic warfare module had our jammers. We could release radar deception aluminum foil called chaff for deceptive radar contacts, for if we were worried about an anti-ship cruise missile. And we also had a system called the Whirly 1, where we could listen for enemy radars that were trying to target us. And so that was the EW module. This was my favorite module, by the way, because I'm an EW guy. So I'd go back there and put on the headset and kind of do my thing back there and give them a little break so they could go get some coffee or a taco or something. In the back here, and it's a door, there would be an ASW module, and in there we controlled our anti-submarine warfare stuff. We had anti-submarine warfare nets. We could talk to aircraft assigned to us for anti-submarine warfare like P-3s or helicopters. But this was mostly an analysis module. We did have the capability to launch deception gear from the back of the boat called fish, and they were torpedo decoys, and we could do that from the ASW module as well. Notice who's in the middle of all this, the CDCO. He's right there, okay? Anytime combat was manned up and flight ops were underway, I was in combat, all right? I was in combat. And I mean, there's not a lot to do at sea other than sleep and eat, so, you know, it's a good place to hang out. Then over here was our surface plot, and that's where we maintained situational awareness on all of the surface ships around us. And that was sometimes, like when you're in a really, really busy place like the Persian Gulf, that was a really, really busy job. So that's sort of what the CDC looked like back in 2000. I have no reason to believe it's changed that much. And again, the procedures are still very much those procedures that were developed by Wiley and Lee and the aviators on the carriers in World War II. The only thing that's changed is the technology and the speed of the information. And there's the large screen display. There's another display that we have over here called the Geeks display, and that includes a lot of off-board ISR and stuff, and has tracks in it that aren't real-time tracks. Sometimes we say they're near real-time, but as Scott Mosman will tell you, a lot of those near real-time tracks aren't remotely near real-time. So anyway, you have to do a lot of track management. So back in my day, this was supposedly ground truth of what was in the air out there. The cruisers with their air search radars, the E2 and the AWACS, would help us put that picture together. But back when I was a CDCO, about 75% of it could be trusted. Yeah, all right? I suspect it's only improved marginally from that, again, because of phantoms, track swaps, stuff like that. All right? So who makes the best CDCO? Well, let me go back. Let me go all the way back to the beginning before we answer that. So think about that. Who makes the best CDCO? So this is a modern CDC. This picture is like from 2023. This is the Nimitz. This is the CDC officer. He's right behind the TAO, micromanaging him. He's on his brick phone, probably talking to the skipper who's on the bridge, a Navy captain, probably selected for Admiral. And this is the TAO, the Tactical Action Officer. As you can see, he's on his own brick, he's also on the phone, and then he's looking at the picture on his own screen in front of him. And this over here is probably a classified chat room with all the other ships in the force. So sort of give you a feel for what's going on there. The only difference from when I was in is we didn't wear flight suits in my CDC. We wore correct Navy uniforms. I wore a long sleeve cotton khaki shirt with nothing on it except my wings, and my TAO also wore a long sleeve khaki shirt. And that was the right thing to wear in CDC. But again, dress standards have degraded since the War on Terror. So who makes the best CDCO? You probably know the answer to this, but I'm going to belabor the obvious here. The guy who flew in EP-3s, the guy who flew in Prowlers, that's a Foxtrot submarine there. That's the Philippines there. And the guy who flew on carriers, that would be me. I'm ready for your questions. Randy. This is Dr. Randy Mullis from the Army Command and General Staff College.
Well, that saves that. So thanks, John. Appreciate it. So just out of curiosity, when the U.S. was developing these technologies in the Navy, was there any collaboration with the Royal Navy in the 30s and early 40s?
Yeah, there was. So there was quite a bit of collaboration, but initially the two developed these things sort of stovepiped, right? Chain Home was an incredibly secret program, all right? But once Great Britain gets involved in the war, the level of technology sharing goes way up. And then when the British are starting to have industrial production for these high-tech systems, they just start to share everything with us. And so we really start to produce the bulk of these. They will do the design, but a lot of the physics for this is actually done by the Brits. A lot of the very advanced radar physics. But we have the Naval Research Lab, which has its own anechoic chamber. And again, it's next to, I think the Naval Aviation Factory was in Anacostia back then. And so it's next to them. So it's really fascinating that once the British did start sharing, it only made the technology piece that much more effective, because the British had learned so many lessons. Like IFF, we got that, the British came up with IFF, and then we adapted it for our purposes. For those of you who don't know what IFF is, identification, friend or foe. And what you can do is you can get it so that if a radar signal hits an airplane, the airplane can actually have a receiver on the airplane that will process the signal and then spit the signal back with an I'm a friendly signal. All right? That's the simplest explanation. Okay. You're allowed to ask about anything. Okay? So if you want to ask about hornets falling in the drink, you can. Let's go over here to Dr. Huber, and then we'll come up front to this man here.
John, I enjoyed your presentation very much. You describe in 42, 43 all of these amazing new procedures being developed at sea and even in battle, and then percolating back to the institutional Navy. My question is, at that same moment, do you have actual research agencies in the Navy devoted to solving this kind of problem, or does it all come from the deployed vessels at sea?
No, so you do most of those agencies inside the Navy. They're either at the Navy Research Lab, but sort of the place that generates what we might call the mission needs or the .mil-PF for it is inside the Bureau of Engineering. Arleigh Burke, for example, is working on anti-aircraft stuff. And that'll lead to radar-fused anti-aircraft shells, which will be a big advantage, particularly at later in the war at the Battle of the Philippine Sea and at Okinawa. So that's Bureau of Engineering. They have different divisions that are looking at this, solving these problems. Admiral Lee will actually be brought back from Okinawa to work on creating even more effective anti-aircraft systems. They're trying to figure out how to disintegrate a kamikaze before it gets close enough to do any damage. They will shoot down kamikazes, but the sheer momentum of the debris will cause almost as much damage as if the kamikaze hadn't hit it. Yeah. This gentleman here, and then we'll come over here.
During the battles on the slot, weren't there high or commanding officers that were skeptical of the radar at use of it, but also didn't realize tactically where to put destroyers that had efficient radar?
Yeah. So, and that approach, again, it's we don't really get the CIC handbook and doctrine, as this is the authoritative doctrine, until the Guadalcanal campaign is long over. And it's really the lessons learned the hard way at Guadalcanal, that they're putting the radar ships in one of the formations. I don't know if it's at Cape Esperance or if it's at the first night battle of Guadalcanal, but they actually have the ships with the best radars are the last ones in line, and they're still going in line formation. They haven't gone to the group formation, which Captain Arleigh Burke and Captain Coward and guys like that will fine-tune for destroyer group and division tactics later in the war, and certainly later in 1943 in the slot. The individuals you're talking about, well, it's a case of Darwin, right? Darwin's law. They will be killed for their mistakes. particularly Admiral Callahan, who is totally responsible for setting up the formation for that first night battle of Guadalcanal, which is such a catastrophe. Of course, it turns out to be a catastrophe for the Japanese as well. It's such a close-fought battle. It's close range, a lot of friendly fire in it. But by the time the sun comes up, the Japanese are still there. And because the Japanese are still there, the airplanes can take off and finish up the wounded survivors, including the battleship. I don't know if it's Hiei or Kirishima is the one that they get the next day, but they get a battleship and sink it, and then Lee comes and sinks the other one a couple nights later. But that's Admiral Callahan, and Callahan is Halsey's chief of staff. It's a tragedy, because Norman Scott, who'd been at Esperance, had learned the hard way, no, this is not how you put the formation together. So he had ideas, this is how we need to put everything together. If I do this again and I'm in command, this is Rear Admiral Norman Scott, here's how I'm going to set it up. I'm going to have my best ships with the SG radar out front to give I&W. I'm going to command. I'll be in the center, but I'll have those ships close enough for TBS voice comms. And so he was ready to do that, and he was in command. But Halsey's chief of staff, Admiral Dan Callahan, didn't like being a pencil pusher down in Noumea, Caledonia. He wanted combat time. And he begged Admiral Halsey, Bill Halsey, who was always a sucker for somebody begging on their knees, and which is why they should have met with him in the Kuehn Mutiny. But anyway, Halsey said, okay, Dan, you can go up and take command. And so Callahan, with no experience, with no anything, takes command. He's the senior guy. And it kind of reminds you of the Royal Navy in the 18th century, you know, when the one admiral is in charge just by virtue of seniority, and he loses Minorca, and so they shoot him. But Callahan is shot, but he's shot by the Japanese. Unfortunately, so is Scott. So both of them are killed. I think Scott is killed due to friendly fire, all right? It's such a nut roll, that first night battle of Guadalcanal. So you're absolutely right. It's a real tragedy. Best book on that is Neptune's Inferno. That's a great book. That's a great book. There's a question over here, and then you, sir, and then we'll go back to Dr. Bjorgi.
Thank you. Can you talk about, are we overly reliant on this technology? What would happen if it didn't work in a pinch? Are commanders trained on how to operate effectively if something went wrong and all this stuff didn't work?
They used to be. So the short answer is they used to be. So when the Soviet Navy was our primary threat, we used to practice MCON Alpha, and we would practice zip-lip procedures for the entire force, all right? And we would go basically into whatever the officer and tactical command's battle orders were, and whatever the ship captain's battle orders were, those would be followed. And it was almost a pure mission command approach. And we called it the composite warfare commander approach. But it could be done without radios, and it could be done radar silent, all right? Now, that didn't mean you couldn't still build a picture, because with satellites, now of course satellites can go away too, but with satellites and air-breathing aircraft, you can still get receivers, don't give you away, but they can suck information in. One of the things we used to practice was the E-2 would go set up about 80 or 90 miles away and rotate there, build the air picture. They weren't very good at building a surface picture back when I was in, but the E-2 Delta can. And then they'd build the picture, and so the battle group would be entirely silent. So we used to do that. We used to be really good at it. And all of the ships that I was ever involved in were really good at it. Now, I had to pay for that when I was on the America as an air winger, because I had to do an MCON night recovery. And then I realized all those MCON night recoveries I'd made other people do when I was the battle group EW officer was sort of paying me back for all the pain and misery that I inflicted on others. I'm not completely confident we can do that anymore, but I don't know. It'd be nice to have somebody from the fleet to say, oh yeah, John, we still do MCON Alpha, we still practice that stuff, we still know how to do counter-targeting. But based on what I've seen in the open news sources, my confidence level is very low that they know how to do that. Yeah, you should be able to do that. It's still a ship. A bullet is still a bullet. An airplane is still an airplane. You can go out there And you can go, well, you know, we're MCON now, and so I'm on my own. Go find a target and sink it, all right? With airplanes, it's a little bit more difficult. We're going to operate in a heavy electronic warfare environment if we ever get involved in a major war. That's what's going on in Ukraine right now. If you can't operate in a heavy electronic warfare environment, you're going to lose. You're going to lose. The Navy knows this. They have a doctrine for it. It's called electronic maneuver warfare, but I don't know how much they actually practice it, especially given the hard times the Navy has fallen on. Did I answer your question? Yes. Okay. Dr. Bjorgi, and then over here, this gentleman.
Yeah, hello. When I was in the Navy serving on an aircraft carrier, one of the schools that I was sent to was a nuclear weapons loading school. And so we'd have these exercises, and the Marines would, come out escorting the atomic bombs. You've mentioned all these modules in the CIC. What module would be involved in receiving orders to use atomic weapons, and how would that, the CIC, would they direct the employment then and the targeting, or how would that be taken care of in a CIC, or would it be?
So about half of that I can't answer, okay? But every carrier, back in my day they were called carrier battle groups, now they're called carrier strike groups. Back in my day, I was on a carrier battle group staff, Commander Carrier Group 2, and we owned two carriers, the USS America and the USS Kennedy. And when we would deploy on one of our carriers, they would put together teams to do exactly what Dr. Bjorgi was asking about, which is employment, deployment of nuclear weapons. Those were called emergency action teams, and the messages that activated them would be called emergency action messages, and certain people would be qualified to be EAM guys, EAM officers, who would break the codes and then deliver the codes to whoever needed them for the decision making, and then you could start the whole process of bringing nuclear weapons up from the magazines, okay? Now, nuclear weapons, well, I can't talk about that, but at any rate, when I was on the battle group staff, I was on that team, okay? And we did drills all the time. So the module where that would take place is actually Tactical Flag Command Center, TFCC. And I didn't talk about that, and so thank you for asking the question. So TFCC is actually attached to combat, all right? And it's here, but there's no doors. You have to go out in a P-way. This is the portside P-way, come out and go back in. So, you know, I'd hear something, TFCC would be asking me questions. I'd go, I'll just come around the corner and talk to you guys. So I'd come out through here, come back in, and I'd talk to those guys. Well, those were the guys that would get the EAMs, and then they would activate the EAM teams. It was always a redundant system, so it wasn't just single point failure. So it was also taking place on the ship, and the communications spaces of the ship would also get those. But again, it was a drill, and you know, everybody'd be running everywhere, and you'd be bumping your knees on knee knockers on the old ships, and it was a goat rope. But I mean, the chances of that occurring, the most we ever exercised that was during workups. I don't remember getting an EAM message ever on a deployed cruise. I mean, we got execute messages for like Desert Storm and Deliberate Force and stuff like that for D-Day and those messages, but I don't remember ever getting a single EAM on deployment on a cruise after we out-chopped from land or the Eastern Pacific in my entire career. The world wonders. Yeah, so there were all these exercises, and so occasionally somebody would forget to put whatever protocol wording would need to be on a message to say it was an exercise. You'd always, during the workups when you did these things, it was always exercise, 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 EAM, activate the EAM team, you know, assemble the EAM team members in Civic, you know. And Civic is the carrier intel space. And we have a Civic guy here today. Where's Scott at? Scott? There he is. There's a Civic. And he's a civic guy, too. All right, sir, you, somebody else. Yes, sir, that gentleman with the burnt orange
With
thing.
the
Yeah.
advancement of drones and surface-to-surface missiles and the expansion of the Chinese Navy, and as you pointed out, the degradation to the U.S. Navy falling on hard times, is the fleet in the South China Sea more vulnerable than it used to be?
The short answer is yes. Okay. I mean, we've been transiting the South China Sea ever since, you know, the 50s. I mean, we had the Taiwan Straits crises, various versions, 50s, 60s, 70s, and Westpac. But then we had Vietnam. So we've been in the South China Sea since the end of World War II. Okay? So we've been there for 80 years. And when the Iran crisis occurred, we spent even more time in the South China Sea as we transited out to the Arabian Gulf. And then, of course, that all morphed into this stupid permanent presence in the Persian Gulf that is still hanging on like a vampire and won't die with our carriers and everything. So, but over time, you know, we've gotten so used to just going through the South China Sea. When we went through the South China Sea in 2000, we used it as an opportunity to practice counter-targeting against the Chinese Navy. I'm not convinced we do that anymore. I think we want the Chinese to see us because we're trying to make sure they know that we do not recognize their maritime claims, which we challenge and which the Admiralty courts have backed us up on as being excessive, and this is the exact legal language, excessive maritime claims, all right? So, however, are we better prepared, better positioned to defend ourselves? Okay, so first battle group I'm on, USS Coral Sea Battle Group. Now this is not in the Pacific, this is in the Mediterranean. We had 6 cruisers and 6 destroyers or frigates in that battle group. Today's battle group is lucky if it has 4 surface ships that are working. They usually have 6, but usually 1 or 2 of them will break and won't be with the battle group, or they'll break halfway across the Pacific because of the maintenance problems that the Navy has. So anytime you want to get on the internet, send something to the White House about the Navy. And this White House actually wants to do something about it, but we'll see, you know, because Congress pays for everything. So we'll see what happens. We don't have a budget, so it's going to be real hard to pay for anything until we get a budget. So because of that, we've degraded. So what I'm telling you is we have half of the capability we had then. Now, we've got more advanced sensor systems. We have a lot of off-board systems. But what we've learned from Ukraine is that off-board space-based sensor systems can also be interfered with, okay? Because you don't have to jam the satellite at the point that the satellite transmits something. All you have to do is jam the receiver at the point of reception. All right, one more. Yes, sir. You, sir. Oh, we're out of time. Okay. Thank you for coming.